The Caves of Dementia by Júlia Rosell Saldaña. Introduction. Nobody could deny that I had gone crazy. Only sometimes, like now, can I enjoy moments of lucidity before my mind fragments again. Anxiety, restlessness, despair. When all these sensations and emotions return, I feel myself falling into a pit of black darkness that no light can illuminate. How did I end up in a mental health wing? It is a good question, dear reader, more so that I can answer you before I must put you in context of who I am. My name is Maria Gelkem. Perhaps this name will mean nothing to you, unless you are knowledgeable in science magazines and especially caving. Throughout my life, and despite my youth, I have travelled around the globe visiting the strange worlds that survive the passage of time under our feet. I have been to America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. I only have left to visit, for simple exploratory morbidity and desire to excel, the poles of our beloved planet. If you're curious, you'll find articles and photo studies by yours truly even in National Geographic, where I've been a regular due to my underground expeditions. Despite my current state of mental weakness, and with the regret of not being able to carry out these activities, I am still filled with pride, when my lucidity allows it, for the legacy I have left for current science and the many discoveries of that I have been a participant. Being land animals who live in concrete burrows with access to both natural and artificial light, I can understand that you find it difficult to grasp the wonders that lurk underground. Life forms that have evolved differently from the ours, both animal and vegetable. Geological strata that indicate the atmospheric and mineral composition of millions of years ago, remains of already extinct life forms that remain more or less in these depths or even in fossil form. As you can see, my field of study is colossal and includes several diverse specialties from scientific disciplines. I could tell you about the wonders of Ecuador's Cueva de los Tallos, which even fascinated astronaut Neil Armstrong. It could expose the incredible crystalline formations of the Mina de Nika cave in Mexico. I could invite you to visit the many thousand-year-old caves in Asia, where there are even incredible temples. The world is full of subterranean places that would awaken your imagination and surprise you in such a way that you would feel in another world. You'll see fantastical worlds that are untouched by light, or that have stood still in the annals of history, long before our ancestors emerged from their caves. Natural wonders like stalagmites and stalactites, crystals, minerals, impossible creatures from other times, or that had not developed in our agoraphobic aerial externalities. What else can I tell you, other than suggesting that if you have the possibility, visit one of the many tourist caves in your area, since you will discover wonders that you will not be able to enjoy on the surface. All this would make you think that a servant is prepared for practically any situation and encounter in these caves. But I must tell you that there are things that humanity should not see, hear, and possibly it is better that they ignore their existence. Sound crazy to you? I agree with him, it's crazy. The same thing that has made me end up in a long-stay psychiatric ward. Luckily, I still have the ability to write to end, in my moments of lucidity, with the tedium that floods and governs my existence. I have never believed in strange things. I have always ignored issues such as UFOs, the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Chupacabra. Things that science disdains and that are part of cryptozoology and ufology. Pseudosciences that study both things hard and from a little orthodox perspective. To me, all these things have always sounded like fantasy, which is the most euphemistic term I can use to refer to them. Cryptozoology. Bullshit, I thought. I always laughed at all these things, and I've learned that it's better not to laugh at something if you don't know. What happened? It all started that day or night. I can't remember clearly right now. I apologize, dear reader, but now I begin to suffer from the mental fragmentation that I mentioned above. I'm sorry, but I can't continue. The images haunt me. They come. The lights, the sounds come to my mind like a flood that sweeps away everything in its path. I arrived in the town of Blue River, British Columbia, Canada, after landing at the Calgary airport and driving 7 hours through Banff, Jasper, and Mount Robson National Parks. Blue River is located in the valley between the Monashee and Caribou Mountains, bordering Wells Grey Provincial Park. It is surrounded by virgin and low-density vegetation precisely because of its location between mountains where snowfall is heavy in winter. Most of the houses look like prefabs or bungalows, and you can tell this is a vacation town. The roads are somewhat neglected, but there is a railway station that connects with other towns. Since I had arrived in October, there was no snow on the nearby mountains, and the temperature was about 2 degrees Celsius. It was 8 in the morning, and the air was so cold that it bothered me a bit to breathe after so many changes in temperature since my departure from Madrid. I had a horrible headache after more than 22 hours awake, the hustle and bustle at the Madrid airport, the jet lag from being on the other side of the world, and the nerves of exploring the newly discovered cave in Wells Grey Provincial Park. When I was finally dropped off at the Glacier Mountain Lodge, my bags were unloaded, and I was able to walk into the room. The first thing I did was lay down on that wonderful queen-size bed that seemed to have my name on it and call out to me. It didn't take long for me to fall into the arms of Morpheus. The phone woke me up. It was Henry, an old friend who had also dared to explore the cave found by accident on a routine flight to census the caribou in the provincial park. Henry was nervous, and I had a hard time understanding him on the phone since my brain cells hadn't rested enough yet to have a decent conversation. We agreed that he would come to see me at the hotel to talk in more detail about what we would do in the next few days. I accepted all his ideas without listening to them. He was not in a position. I had about 2 hours to clean up before he arrived. I stretched and yawned, checked the time on my cell phone, and saw that it was already 12 o'clock. With my eyes, I decided to look at that room where I was staying. The European style was very well achieved, although the decorations seemed more typical of the 60s of the 20th century. What I liked the most were the impeccably white sheets on the bed. The white was so pure that it reminded me of snow. The bed was so comfortable that I was embarrassed to have to leave it. The room had a television and a sofa, pictures with the landscapes of the area painted, a tea table with 2 chairs, and a window covered by a translucent curtain that allowed to see without problems the views of the mountains in the distance. The room was very nice, the town and views beautiful, but I needed a coffee. I showered and dressed in clean clothes and went down to reception to be told where I could get a coffee, if possible European ristretto, not American. The hotel staff were extremely attentive, which made me instinctively smile. I was escorted into the dining room. I sat down in an armchair and they served me a coffee that smelled like heaven. It didn't take long for them to bring me some donut-shaped soft pastries, filled with jam. At that time, that coffee and those pastries, while sitting in that comfortable chair, seemed to be in heaven. I was still tired, but at the moment I didn't care. I was looking out the window while having my coffee. When Henry's phone rang, he was walking into town. I gave him directions to the hotel, and we agreed that he would have coffee with me. In a few minutes, his voice gave him away as he appeared at the dining room door with open arms to come give me a hug. We hugged and told each other a couple of jokes before he joined me in that coffee ritual. Henry was a tall man, 6'2". He sported a somewhat unkempt beard of an almost bright natural blonde. His curly blonde hair had reddish strands next to his green eyes, and his Nordic features could have landed him in more than one magazine. Too bad his taste in dressing left much to be desired. We were talking about the cave we were going to descend into tomorrow. Sarlacc's Pit. This cave had been discovered by a helicopter flight in order to census the caribou population of the Wells Grey Provincial Park. According to theories, the cave had been uncovered by the melting of nearby glaciers due to climate change. The cave entrance is 100 meters long by 60 wide. Its estimated depth is 135 meters, and the only descent test carried out has reached 80 meters. Until this time, the full depth of the cave and what lies below is unknown. It had been decided to carry out the expedition to the depths at the end of the summer since the entrance to the cave was, due to the thaw, part of the course of a river that caused a waterfall during the hot months until the end of the thaw, generating a mist that impeded visibility. Henry had been talking to members of the First Nations, that is, Native Americans from Canada, to find out if they knew of the cave. Apparently, there were certain legends that mentioned creatures that lived underground and came out of the caves in the area at night, until the raven, a mythological figure of adaptation and creation, locked them up. They did not have specific information about Sarlacc's pit, as it had never been explored due to the difficulties of going down it without specialized tools. Currently, most of the talk between First Nations and local authorities was to give the cave a non-temporary name, as Sarlacc's pit was used in honor of the movie Return of the Jedi. After talking about the cave, Henry informed me that the next day the members of the expedition would come for me at 10 o'clock in the morning, giving me time to rest. As he told me, the main idea was for a member of the expedition to stay in Blue River with a radio station, set up a small camp outside the cave, since it is in an area that is difficult to access, and set up radio repeaters to facilitate communications throughout the cave. The objective was to be able to report the findings that we found as we progressed. Because the cave is located in a natural park, we would have a member of the local authorities assigned to the base camp to ensure that we do not tarnish or cause damage to the park's ecosystem. My partner left after the explanations given. I got up and went to the room again. I changed into a comfortable nightgown and stretched out on the bed to sleep until the next day. It had been an exhausting day. I woke up with a smile at 7 in the morning. I got dressed and prepared the equipment that I had brought in the suitcases to put it in backpacks for easy transport. I left everything ready and dressed in the necessary clothing for the cold and the climbing that had to be done. I went down to the dining room where they served me a continental breakfast with juices, toast, scrambled eggs, coffee, pastries. For a moment my stomach closed at the sight of so much food, but then it opened again when somehow my body understood that it would require a lot of energy. When I was done, I went to get my backpacks and left the hotel waiting for the members of the expedition to pick me up. I decided to walk around the hotel entrance a bit to stretch my legs. The thrill of adventure got me. It was a while until 2 vans arrived and stopped in front of my backpacks. A man got out and flashed a smile when he saw me, waved to me and walked over to my backpacks, reaching for them. He was a man of medium height, stocky and robust, a member of the First Nations. He showed that he knew the region. I thanked him for the gesture but told him that I could handle the backpacks by myself. Despite this, he insisted and helped me load them into the van. He opened the back door and helped me up to sit inside. Henry was the driver, and he greeted me, introduced me to Sose, co-pilot and guide to these lands. He was the personable man who had helped me with the bags. He also introduced me to Dmitri, who came from Russia, a renowned geologist if ever there was one. He told me that he would introduce me to the rest of the members once we had reached our destination. Just before turning off the road to get on dirt roads, a car from the local authorities stopped us to ask if we were members of the expedition. Henry effusively answered yes and somehow immediately became friends with the man, who led us the rest of the way to Sarlacc's pit. During the journey, Sose and Dmitri were talking about old legends of their respective lands, and they made small breaks in which they wanted to make us part of the conversation, where they alternated with gastronomic conversations, where they made us reach the conclusion that the most universal dish that exists are the meatballs. We reached a point where we speculated that the first question to ask an extraterrestrial race was precisely if they also made meatballs. With this, we would leave doubts about its universality. Although the car ride lasted about 5 hours, it seemed trivial and short thanks to such a relaxed conversation. We had to go on dirt roads as there were no roads, and I was treated to spectacular views of antediluvian forests, crystal-clear lakes, and incorruptible skies. While I was distracted admiring the landscape and listening to Sose and Dimitri's diatribes in the background, the car stopped. Catching me out of the blue, I almost got confused. We had arrived. We parked to the left of that huge cavity, that seemed to want to reveal the secrets of the depths of the earth, and we all got out of the vans. The agent who had accompanied us introduced himself as Max. He was a middle-aged man, slim and tall, with a moustache that gave him a unique personality. He greeted us all and told us with joy that it was a pleasure to be with us for this experience. He was happy to watch over us and collaborate with us. Henry then introduced me to the rest of the members who would be part of this expedition. Erwin, an American biologist specializing in microclimates. Chisulo, speleologist and mountaineer originally from Malawi. Shuchang, a radio frequency engineer who has worked all his life at Huawei, and Emily, a Canadian diver specializing in underwater caves. Once everyone was introduced, we started to set up the base camp. In a few hours, we had set up the tents, monitoring equipment, beds, radio station. When we finished, Henry made us all stand together for a Polaroid photograph. Max offered to make it for us. Then we sat down in the improvised dining room to eat and explain the next steps. Actually, we spoke little about the cave, and we were distracted by casual talk of trivialities. We were all nervous. We received a radio communication from Blue River. Our man, named John, asked us if we had everything ready. Boredom was eating him up after so many hours without hearing from us. Henry replied that everything was going according to plan and asked him not to be so bored, that he would need to be prepared in case something went wrong. Being in a mountainous area and at such a northern latitude, he came to us at night. The night view was beautiful, and the entire Milky Way could be seen. The cold was strong. We were more prepared, and inside the tents we were fine. Finally, we talked about how we would proceed next. Chisulo and I would go down first, little by little, trying to reach the bottom of the cave. Once down, we would mount a radio repeater and secure the wiring to facilitate the descent of the rest of the members. Once we were all below, we would set up a small outpost to maintain light and communications with the surface, while John would be our support in the populated area in close contact with the authorities. The spotlights pointed to the entrance of the cave. Chisulo and I prepared to go down. We put on the necessary equipment and took the necessary wiring. We both looked into the infinite darkness that occupied the depths of that hole. We put on our helmets with flashlights, and, after creating a foothold, we began to descend. We thought that we would find most of the frozen walls, but it was not so. We slid little by little while we secured the anchors and the lamps to light the way down. Between the descent, the anchors, the mounting of the lamps, and the extra weight of the communications and lighting equipment, it took us an hour and a half to reach the depths of the cave. The estimates of 135 meters were wrong. The bottom was 215 meters. When we arrived, we secured the ropes and immediately set up the radio repeater. We could not see the ceiling of that cavern, or its width or length. Our flashlights did not give much. We informed of our arrival at the bottom and began to assemble the lighting system. We were surrounded by darkness, with a temperature of about 8 degrees and a humidity of 65%. Chisulo couldn't help but play with the echo and spent several minutes testing how long it took for the echo to respond to him. I laughed, eliciting echoes of laughter that made me shudder. 2. Over the next several hours, crew members and material were brought down. We rudimentarily set up a forklift with ropes to facilitate the raising and lowering of samples and material. When we had the advance guard ready, we turned on the lights. My breath was cut off for a second. In front of us, there was a tunnel of infinite blackness, of which we could not see the bottom. The cave was about 20 meters high by 40 wide, and galleries could be sensed on both sides. Despite knowing that during the summer the cave was the final destination of a river, we did not see any accumulation of water, but we did hear noise from it. We discovered that the water seeped through some holes at the bottom of the drop tunnel, whose depth we did not know. We mapped our discoveries as much as possible, and the team went to work. Dimitri was hammering the floor and walls to extract stone samples, while Emily investigated the holes using a drone to find out how far they went and if there was a mass of water that she could explore. Chisulo and I tried to map the galleries on either side of the tunnel without going too far into the dark depths. and Owen looked at the samples Dimitri had taken for life forms under the microscope. The echo gave us away because we had broken the silence of that lonely underground place. We were soon certain that we had established our first outpost deep within the cave and proceeded to report our findings to the surface team. Henry, as always, was elated by the results. He soon made us bring down a bottle of champagne to celebrate being the first humans in all of history to have reached the bottom of that cave. We toasted and drank, the echo making it sound like the cave itself was proud of our milestones that day. When we finished with a certain degree of drunkenness, Dimitri was explaining to us how the cave had been formed, the types of rocks, the influence of water and ice and how old it was. Despite having knowledge of geology, my knowledge could not compare to Dimitri's, so I listened carefully about the hardness of the different layers of the cave and what we had to watch out for to avoid problems for our survival. Perhaps out of jealousy or really to expose her discoveries, Emily showed us images of the holes descending into the even darker depths of the cave in search of the missing water, and exposed her discovery of an underground lake at a depth of 50 meters from the cave floor. She told us, we don't know if she was joking or not, that those holes seemed artificial due to the perfection of their rounded shape. Time passed, despite the fact that being in such depth, we did not appreciate any temporal advance other than what the clocks marked us. Little by little, we were advancing towards the bottom of that tunnel, and we did not see any complex life form. Theorized that it had not been colonized in this section due to the difficulty involved as the entrance was covered with snow and ice during the cold months and later due to the constant fall of water. After all, it had been a little over a year since this cave had been discovered, and it was unknown what influence the outside ecosystem had on it. If we, in order to descend, have required advanced mechanisms, what can it cost other beings to come down here? It should be remembered that our temporality is not applicable in the same way to other forms of life. Do you remember how slowly time passed when you were little? The same happens with other living beings. I will explain myself. What perception of time do you think a fly or an insect whose life is days, weeks, or months has? What meaning do our years have for beings who live 2.5 years maximum? And on a microscopic level where many life forms can live for mere minutes? You must think that our time frame is ours alone, and that somehow it is only up to us to count the seconds as the average heartbeat of someone of our species. Minutes, hours, days, weeks, years, they are nothing more than our artificial way of counting time for our egocentric approval and our control manias. We were exploring the galleries little by little. It was clear that no human being had descended before, since there was no trace of tools or human culture. Not even the American Indians, who used to explore all of their territories, had descended and explored this natural wonder. The entire cave showed signs of erosion by water, in its liquid and solid stages. It was easy, to a certain extent, to get used to the idea of its creation hundreds of thousands of years ago, due to the mineral typology that we were finding. Most of these small galleries had an end, some narrowed to a point where it was impossible for us to proceed with their exploration because they did not fit due to our size. Little by little we mapped the area and continued advancing to the depths of that dark, gloomy, and silent gorge, where only the echoes of our footsteps, voices and tools could be heard. When we had advanced about 200 meters, something stood out in that cold and rocky environment. A structure that resembled an eroded column stood in the middle of the cave. We made measurements and saw that it was exactly at the midpoint of the total width of the cave. To me, personally, it did not seem very natural due to the perfection and cut of its forms, but Dimitri dedicated himself to observing it for a long time. He did not seem convinced in the same way that this was one more geological stratum. As time passed, he was getting nervous. That did not fit his knowledge. Perhaps we would have needed an archaeologist, he told us, since this transcended his mineral knowledge. Who could expect to find something artificial or that did not fit the natural development in a cave so old and never before explored? We all wondered the same thing, and it showed in the looks, even if we didn't express it. It was a mystery. As we advanced, we realized that something was not right. The walls were much smoother than expected, and despite following the morphology of what we had seen so far, it seemed that this section had really been excavated artificially. We looked at the smooth relief of the walls, the absence of galleries and holes that we had seen so far, and we tried to speculate on the real possibility of an artificial construction, which was impossible for us due to the age of the cave and the difficulty of accessing it. To her, perhaps there would be other hitherto unknown entrances. Was the entrance to the cave a natural geological accident that had ended up connecting with this part? More and more questions were being opened and more answers were missing. Dimitri alluded to the fact that the geological composition corresponded, due to its erosion, to the Miocene, a period that included from 23 million years ago to 5 million years ago. While he was explaining this theory to us, he was highly annoyed. They could not be artificial formations at that time, although the cold and slight erosion had maintained the forms to such an extent. At that time, there were no humans who could perform such architectural feats, not to say that something of such magnitude should have been built by beings much taller and more robust than us, Homo sapiens. We decided to think and theorize that it was coincidence that had led this section to form in such a way that it gave the impression of being artificial, as is the case with the Yomagumi monument in the seas of Japan, where it has been concluded that said stepped formation is natural. We kept moving while we placed radio repeaters and beacons so, like Hansel and Gretel, our return would be easier following those crumbs of light. We were transmitting our findings to the surface team. The echo of our footsteps seemed to go somehow, marking a rhythm that unconsciously gave us peace in that darkness that surrounded us. Later, the galleries no longer began through irregular openings, but now resembled carved shapes reminiscent of tall rectangles for beings taller than us. Dimitri grew increasingly nervous as Chisulo and I photographed these gallery entrances, slowly and sheepishly exploring those sections without going too far. Our step continued forward, marveling more and more at the perfection of that section that seemed to have no end. Everything was going well until something flaked me. That rhythm of our steps was not the same. Unconsciously, I realized that something was wrong. I turned around and asked if everyone was okay. The answer was unanimous. Everything was fine, but someone did not answer. Emily, who was the last one, was not there. I raised the alarm and we started looking for her, but we couldn't find her. There was no trace of the equipment he was carrying from her or her, not anything that could give us any clues as to her location. We decided to go back in case she had come back, but we couldn't find her anywhere. We contacted Henry to report Emily's disappearance, and for the first time I heard a note of disapproval and anger in his voice. We decided to go as a group through the areas already explored and focus on the galleries to be explored to strengthen their search. As time passed, we became more nervous. How could someone disappear without a trace, without footprints, or anything that could serve as a clue? Didn't she hear us when we called her? We were cataloguing the galleries from the beginning of the cave to where we had stayed. Despite knowing there were openings that it couldn't fit through, we made efforts to get past Dimitri and Owen's cameras for the smaller holes. When we arrived at the galleries with a rectangular entrance, we realized something. They were not simple galleries. They seemed like rooms in which there was nothing left inside. More than waste of dirt accumulated by the passage of time of dust and rock. Again, everything changed in one of the rooms. The temperature was much warmer, and the bottom was not visible. We had recently passed in front of it, and it was difficult for us to look inside it, since we had only mapped the entrances and galleries without going into detail or its interior. If Emily had gotten lost here, it had been, very recently. Just in case, we decided to access as a group and go to the bottom. This was really a corridor about 4 meters wide by 6 meters high. As we went along, the temperature increased. 12, 14, 16, 18 degrees centigrade. We were starting to get hot. We reached a point where that perfect corridor forked. There were 2 paths to follow. We decided to split up and maintain radio contact. On the left were Dimitri and I, while on the right were Chisulo and Erwin. Dimitri, despite knowing the importance of the search for Emily, delayed the search by noticing the irregularities in the walls. I was getting nervous because it was pressing to continue. At one point, he gave me a scare. He made me stop in my tracks and showed me some crystals that looked like bismuth. He made me look at them more closely, and we realized that they were not crystals. They were complex artificial artifacts. Dimitri pointed out some small holes in the walls, from where said crystals seemed to have fallen. Due to the passage of time, it was difficult to appreciate it, but those holes actually seemed to be the remains of some type of mechanism that the crystals were part of. The mystery of that cave continued to grow with every step we took. Dimitri seemed to be losing his mind, as if something inside his brain couldn't take in what we'd found. He was a geologist, after all, and this defied everything he knew. It took me a few minutes to make him react, and for him to come to himself. I allowed him to put those crystals in his backpack, but reminded him that the important thing now was the search for Emily. He made me take photos of those holes, and only then could we continue with the search. That corridor seemed to have no end. We had already been more than 400 meters from the fork, and we saw that far and wide there were still more and more holes with crystals. Dimitri made an observation he hadn't fallen for. What if those crystals weren't really crystals? What if they ended up like this due to the passage of time? Knowing the hundreds of thousands of years, no, possibly millions of years that had elapsed since the creation of that cave, what could be the true origin of what we had found? Was this its original form? The questions kept attacking my mind. I had to make an effort to get them out of my thoughts and focus on the priority of looking for Emily. There came a point where the reflection of our light temporarily blinded us. We were so engrossed in the questions that haunted us that we didn't realize that we had reached the end of the corridor. A smooth wall blocked our way. Dimitri spent a few minutes looking at the wall, tapping his hammer a couple of times and saying with a trembling voice that the wall was artificial. Definitely his ability to notice details was much higher than mine. He soon pointed out a strange rectangular stone, clearly artificial on one side of the wall about 3 meters above the ground. It looked like some kind of button stuck from lack of use. Seeing that we could not advance there, I tried to contact Chisulo and Erwin, but they did not give any answer. We decided to go back to get to the fork and try to make contact with the members who had gone to the right. On the way back, I contacted Henry to explain what we had found. His voice was trembling too when he answered me, possibly out of concern over Emily's disappearance and nervousness over our discoveries. 3. We reached the fork, and still had no news from Chisulo. And Erwin, radio contacts were unsuccessful, and Henry kept asking us if we knew anything. We entered that corridor expecting the worst. We moved forward with haste, hoping to find our companions. We heard our accelerated footsteps through the silence of the darkness. Suddenly, we stopped. We heard someone running towards us. We focused our flashlights, hoping to see who it was. It was Chisulo. He was pale and sweating. He was running like hell. When he reached our position, he stopped and started shouting in his native language. We didn't understand him. He was clearly upset, as if he had seen something horrible. I noticed that he was not wearing equipment of any kind. He had been running in the dark hallway non-stop. I tried to calm him down and make him see reason to no avail. Finally, I couldn't think of anything else but to slap him, which caused him to shut up for a couple of seconds and fix his eyes on me. He had worked. I was panting, but he was apologizing to me. I hugged him instinctively, telling him he was safe, to calm down, to take a deep breath. Chisulo took a few minutes to recover. Then he explained to us that his journey along the corridor with Erwin seemed to be going well until they began to hear some whispers, which they thought were the product of his imagination. They advanced until they reached a clearly artificial room, whose purpose was unknown. They searched the room to see if there was any trace of Emily, but found nothing related to her, although they did find strange markings that looked like some kind of code and a locked platinum door. He went on to explain that during the exploration of the room, The whispers turned into voices that echoed everywhere, causing them to panic, so they decided to return to the entrance of the room little by little. As they approached, a dull thud from behind the platinum door startled them, stopping their progress. They shined their flashlights on the door, hoping to find the source of the knocking, which stopped just as it had started. The reflection of the light on the door made it difficult to see, but they were aware that it was opening without a sound. The door was slowly opening, or perhaps it was their fear-clouded perception that made them watch the door open in slow motion. When the door opened fully, they saw an amorphous figure writhing. Maybe it was a visual effect, maybe a hallucination, but neither of them could move. Those seconds seemed to last forever, and suddenly, the lights of the flashlights failed. They were both silent, in total darkness, trying to hear what that thing was that had come out the door. Time passed and they couldn't locate it, when Erwin, who was holding on to Chisulo's arm, suddenly let go. Chisulo tried to find his partner in the dark, but he couldn't find him. His instinctive reaction was to flee. He shrugged off his now useless equipment and felt along the walls until he found the corridor behind him and began to run away from there in the dark. It was then that he came to us, in a state of shock that luckily was temporary, and we managed to stop. Once calmed down, we managed to convince him to take us to that room. At first he was reluctant, but he understood that we had to find Erwin at all costs. We had already lost 2 members in strange ways. The situation was desperate, and the morale of the team had evidently dropped to a very poor level. We proceed carefully down the right corridor, paying no attention to the walls until we reached the room Chisulo told us about. Indeed, that room was artificial, very well built since it must have endured a long time without presenting cracks due to the passage of time. Chisulo's team was on the ground, their flashlights were on, and there was no sign of Erwin or his team. At the end of that room was the platinum door, closed almost hermetically. Dimitri jumped at the sight of the door, and as if some strange force had taken hold of him, he lunged at it and slammed the hammer down on it, uttering what were surely profanities in his native language. Chisulo came up behind him and tried to push him away from the door and calm him down until he turned and hit him with the hammer, causing him to fall to the ground. When he was free from Chisulo, Dimitri continued pounding on the platinum door. Those bangs of metal on metal resounded throughout the room in a repetitive way by the echo. My head hurt again. Chisulo was on the floor, confused, and I didn't know how to react. I immediately contacted Henry, explaining the situation to him. He didn't know how to help us, and blanked out. Silence reigned on the radio. Finally, I came up with the only possible idea: knock out Dimitri, who had lost his mind, and take him to the surface. From where we could figure out what to do to find Erwin and Emily. I managed, after speaking with Chisulo, that he knocked out Dimitri with a chokehold. He carried him to the beginning of the cave while I carried all the equipment. The heat of the corridor, the weight of the team, the discomfort over what had happened, the change in temperature when I returned to the central gallery weighed too much on me. I was exhausted. Chisulo, on the other hand, seemed to have found the strength to save Dimitri from himself and constantly encouraged me to keep walking until I reached the entrance. When we arrived, we tied up Dimitri and coordinated with the surface to bring him up. When the poor unconscious man reached the top, we prepared ourselves to go up to the surface. The climb was hard and tiring, but just as it had been during the walk with Dimitri, Chisulo constantly encouraged me during the climb, which made it more bearable. The surface team helped us with the pulley and hoist system so that we could go up faster, but all that time seemed eternal. When we reached the surface, it was broad daylight, and we were greeted by the serious faces of Max, Henry, and Shuchang. They were obviously worried. Max offered to call the authorities to try to coordinate a search, which Henry objected to due to the risk of an uncharted cave. While Max and Henry argued, Shuchang checked to see if Dimitri was in any kind of damage and offered to give the 3 of us who had come back from those mysterious caves of insanity a little medical checkup. He was attentive and ruled out any exogenous influence that had caused such states in Dimitri and Chisulo. He told us that apart from being a telecommunications engineer, he was a doctor. He made the joke that Henry proposed him to be part of the expedition because his knowledge was worth two. Hearing something funny felt good, and despite the concern and fear that invaded us, we listened to our medical colleague and tried to have a relaxed chat, at least while Henry and Max's discussion lasted. Shortly after Dimitri woke up, he was confused because he did not know where he was or how he had come to the surface. Shu Chang came over to explain what had happened recently, calmed him down and gave him a medical checkup. He tried to find out if he was aware of his moment of madness when he lunged at the door, to which Dimitri replied that he didn't know what he was talking about. When he collected himself, he walked over to Henry and Max, who were still arguing, almost to the point of a fight, and stepped between them and pushed them apart somewhat aggressively. He yelled at them and reminded them that their companions had disappeared and that it was essential that a plan be hatched to find them. It was not the time for sterile discussions or testosterone samples. When they both calmed down, they approached us and asked how we were, how we felt about what had happened. We told them that we were fine, within what was possible, and that we were happy to see them. We decided to prepare food to gain strength and talk about how to proceed given the situation. During the meal, there was silence. No one seemed to want to face the situation. Dimitri decided to drown his sorrows in vodka, while Chisulo ate like there was no tomorrow. My stomach was closed, and I had to force myself to eat. Given the situation, I decided to take the initiative and lay out a potential plan to find Erwin and Emily. At the moment, we knew that Erwin had disappeared after the opening of the platinum door, and this had to be one of the priorities. Not knowing the real veracity of what was exposed about whispers, voices, and the strange creature behind the door, we had to focus our efforts on opening it and finding Erwin. Since we were clear about where he had disappeared, we had to gather explosives in case we did not have a mechanical way to open the door and study the walls of the room to prevent it from collapsing due to the force of the explosion. Despite having disappeared before, we should look for Emily once we find any clues about her disappearance. With no other ideas, it seemed that my plan was the only feasible one. Shu Chang immediately put all his efforts into making a remote-controlled explosive, while Chisulo gathered the necessary tools to attempt to open the door mechanically. Henry tried to encourage us with his positivism and good humour, while Max assured us that if necessary, he would notify the authorities to have more troops. The food gave us new strength and the desire to continue the search, except for Dimitri, who had entered a spiral of drunkenness that made him delirious almost on the verge of delirium. We didn't have time for him, and we understood that it was his way of venting after the situation he had experienced. When we had the whole team ready, we got together in a circle, and like children from some secret club, we put our hands together as a symbol of unity and strength and decided to go ahead with the plan. Chisulo and I set off, leaving Dimitri in the hands of the surface team, and descended again, hoping to find Erwin and Emily. Having everything assembled, the rappel down was fast despite the weight of the equipment we were carrying. We slid as fast as the ropes would allow until we reached the bottom. When we arrived, the lights were still on and clearly marked the way forward. We advanced through the cave until we reached the fork. We both took a deep breath and went to the right, hoping to reach that mysterious room with the damn platinum door as soon as possible. It didn't take us long to get to the room, which was terribly hot compared to the main gallery. We went to the platinum door and tried to open it with the tools Chisulo had brought. We spent a long time trying to open it without success, and we had no choice but to think about the use of explosives. Before proceeding with such desperate action, we looked at the doorframe, tried to look at the state of the surrounding walls and what effect the explosion might have on the structural integrity of the room and the cave itself. We were explaining to the surface team our attempts to open the door and our investigations into the condition of the walls and structural integrity. We concluded that the walls and ceiling should not be heavily damaged by the explosion, so we set up the explosives and moved away according to Shachang's instructions. When we were ready, we covered our ears and used the remote detonator. The noise was deafening, and the explosion threw huge amounts of dust over us, despite the distance, causing us to have a strong coughing fit. Silence reigned again, and when the dust cleared, we saw that the door and its frame were still there, but the supporting walls had been blown away by the explosion. The door stood tall and imposing against its frame, which gave us the feeling that it was a joke, or that the door was defiant in our presence. Chisulo, at that moment, approached the door looking angry and kicked it hard. Lacking a foothold, it tipped back until it hit the floor with a loud metallic thud that echoed through the room and kicked up a new cloud of dust. Our door kicker turned to me with a smirk. He must have felt like a giant after knocking down that defiant door that had withstood the force of the blast. 4. In front of us lay that hollow where the door used to be. We waited a few minutes in case our calculations were incorrect and the explosion had affected the structural integrity of the room. There was no serious damage that could cause a problem, and the mysterious markings on the room that Chisulo had mentioned remained intact, so further study was possible. Now we could resume the search for our companions. With renewed strength, we crossed the threshold of the door that now lay fallen at our feet. Before us, a corridor that was lost in the darkness due to the limit of illumination of our flashlights. We proceeded with caution, looking at all the walls and floors in case there was any clue that would reveal Erwin's whereabouts. There was a moment when we had to stop in our progress. Huge stairs descended to depths even greater than we had been. Those stairs showed two things: the artificial nature of the cave, and that the users of it were much larger than us. The steps were separated from each other by about 2 feet. Chisulo and I looked at each other strangely and looked at the bottom of those stairs at the same time. I swallowed hard, and I think my partner did the same. We didn't understand anything. Despite our feeling of strangeness and helplessness, we rushed down those stairs carefully in order to clarify the situation and find our partner. The stairs went down and down. It became tiresome and bland because we could not see the end of the stairs. We continued ascending. 50 meters, 100 meters, 150 meters. Finally, we reached the bottom of said stairs. The reflection of our flashlights alerted us that there was, again, a platinum door similar to the one we had brought down above. This one, however, was different. There were marks that denoted some type of writing that was unknown to us and did not correspond to any known system. In turn, there was a large knob that allowed us to open it without any difficulty. When we opened it, we entered a room that the lanterns could not illuminate. Chisulo took out a flare and threw it as hard as he could. For a few moments, we could see that we were in a huge circular room, vaulted, with many more inscriptions like the ones on the door. We couldn't see the bottom, but we decided to keep going by prioritizing our search for Erwin. By the time we got to the flare, it had almost burned out. We light up the room as we go, hoping to find our partner. And finally, we reached the end of said room. A wall blocked our path. We couldn't go any further, and we didn't know where Erwin might have gone. We decided to mount some of the lighting equipment that we still had to illuminate the entirety of that circular vault. It took a long time, but it was worth it, since the room showed us all its splendor. There were not only those marks, but countless strange crystalline artifacts arranged in a geometric way, like the ones Dmitri found on the ceiling. Thanks to the light, we also realized that there were marks throughout the vaulted room that corresponded to some kind of almost hermetic closure, like doors that we could only see because of the lighting. We approached these doors and tried to notice, due to the wear on the walls, which one showed some sign of recent use, that is, that it had been opened recently. We spent a long time going through all the doors. Finally, we found one that showed that it had been recently opened. We tried to find a way to open it mechanically, forcing it despite the fact that the joint with the wall left little more than a millimeter to leverage. The results were unsuccessful, and we did not know how to proceed. Then it occurred to me, What if the crystals are good for something? I threw my canteen to the ceiling to see if I could get any of them to fall. After several attempts, I got it. With the crystal in hand, I approached the door and it began to glow. To the left of the door, something similar to a hologram appeared, which I touched. A creaking sound marked the opening of the door, which moved back and slid to the side, revealing a new corridor in front of us. How could such an ancient mechanism exist? How could it work after all this time? More unanswered questions. We advanced fearfully through that narrow corridor, through which we had to line up one in front of the other, without knowing what we would find. About 50 meters further on, we found another door. We approached the glass, and it opened. A new room appeared before us, even stranger than the previous one. It was rectangular, about 6 meters high by 10 wide. It was illuminated by a kind of bluish crystals, which gave a gloomy and depressing tone, and to one side there was a kind of large sarcophagus. At the bottom was another door. We decided to turn off the flashlights to save battery power, and we approached the sarcophagus. There was a noise coming from inside, but we couldn't identify it. We tried to figure out how to open the sarcophagus, as it didn't respond to glass like the doors. Finally, it was as easy as sliding the lid of said device, which opened without problem. Inside it was a humanoid form covered in a thin layer of gelatinous tendrils that moved. Chisulo tried to remove that strange jelly, and what we saw horrified us. It was Erwin, who seemed to be in an annoying dream. We took him out of the sarcophagus, and Chisulo carried him, still dripping that gelatinous mass that he had on top. We decided to leave when the door at the back of the room opened. An amorphous silhouette was slowly moving towards us. I panicked, and I suspect Chisulo too, as we started running down the narrow corridor to get to the gallery entrance as soon as possible. We didn't even dare look at each other. We both kept running without waiting to know that he was that being. We were running, panting, sweating. When we got to the room where we caused the explosion, the radio rang. It was Henry. He was worried about not knowing anything about us. We did not set up any radio repeaters beyond said room, and we had lost contact. Time was pressing and we couldn't respond. Our priority was to reach the entrance without looking back. We ran those hundreds of meters that separated us from the surface with terror in our minds. We reached the entrance and, in a hurry, tied Erwin up and reported to the surface for him to be taken up. We followed behind, climbing as fast as we could. When we reached the surface, we fell to the ground, exhausted. We were safe and we had found Erwin. The rest of the members approached us. Shucheng and Max carried our unconscious partner to a bed and gave him a medical checkup. We saw Shucheng taking samples of the jelly. Meanwhile, Henry brought us water and asked us what had happened, what we had seen, and what we had discovered. We tried to tell him everything, but his look revealed that he didn't believe us. As always, he tried to boost our morale with his humour, without giving it any more importance, and he congratulated us on finding Erwin. When we asked how Dimitri was feeling, loud snoring made us understand that he was fine despite the circumstances. We realised that it was night again. We were all exhausted and decided that we needed to rest. We dined in the dining tent in silence, overwhelmed by what had happened, and went to sleep. That night, I had a nightmare in which I was in an endless corridor, lit by fluorescent lights, from which I could not escape. I ran down the said corridor and stopped, hoping to find windows or doors, but there was only that infinite corridor with fluorescent light. In the nightmare, I was sweating and having trouble breathing. There was a moment when the lights were going out on one side and the other, and that darkness caused by the lack of light was reaching me. I woke up with a jump, panting and anxiety through the roof. It was hard for me to shake off the confusion of the dream. So I took a deep breath and looked around me. It seems that I was the last to wake up. I got up, still remembering what happened yesterday, and left the dorm tent to see where my companions were. The day was cloudy and the air was cold, almost icy. Sos greeted me and brought me a strong coffee. I said good morning and asked where he had been, to which he replied that he went to Blue River to see John and to get supplies for the camp. He was as affable as ever, a friendly, smiling face that was a bit of a break from what had happened yesterday. Hearing me talking to Soz, Henry came out of the dining tent to say good morning with his arms wide open. It was obvious from his look that he was hiding his discomfort at Emily's disappearance. He grabbed my arm and took me to the dining room, where the rest of the classmates were. On the table was a varied breakfast that smelled very good. Erwin seemed fine, a bit confused, and he was talking to Dimitri. Chisulo, Max, and Shuchang were playing cards over breakfast. No one seemed to want to talk about what had happened. I approached Erwin and put my hand on his shoulder, asking him how he was, to which he replied that he was fine. He didn't seem to be upset about what happened yesterday. I asked him if he was aware of it, to which he told me that he didn't know what he was talking about. He had no trace of that jelly, and my impression was that the shock was great enough to forget what happened. To recap, we had one physically missing, Emily, and two potential mentally missing, Dimitri and Erwin. I sat down at the table for coffee and breakfast. The trio of cards asked me if I wanted to play with them, to which I politely replied in the negative. Seeing the attitude of the group, I jumped up and asked what we were going to do to find Emily, if we were going to let what had happened the day before go by. Silence reigned. Nobody wanted to answer me. Henry entered the store, coffee in hand, and with an angry face that he had never seen before. He banged on the table, started yelling that we were a team and we had to do something to find Emily, whatever the cost. Dimitri and Erwin replied to Henry that they didn't want to go down to that devilish cave again, to which Chisulo replied that they owed it to him that they could sit so calmly at that table now. They started arguing while Shuchang and Max tried to put things in order. The atmosphere was heated, and when it seemed that the situation was going to get worse, Sose entered with a face of few friends and stood up to Dimitri, Erwin, and Chisulo. He snapped at them that this was no time to argue when a human life was at stake. For a moment we were all afraid of our fellow First Nations. We had not seen him like this, and we did not know that he had so much character. Silence reigned again, and apologies began among the members of the expedition. The situation had finally calmed down. Henry ran out of the store to return in a few minutes with a map that he put on the table and that he had drawn according to what we had been telling him on the radio, as well as from our photographs and mapped areas of the cave. There were notations all over the map: height, width, depth, holes, galleries, location of the crystals, the column, the smooth walls, the strange rooms, the doors, the sarcophagus, the place of Emily's disappearance. She must have missed the mark. Up all night doing such an enormous task to have a map in such good condition and detail. Henry had had an idea. If Emily had disappeared behind us, she must be at the beginning of the cave, perhaps near the water. He pointed out the holes Emily had mapped and pulled out the pictures he took with the drone. We hadn't thought of that possibility, and maybe he was right. We had nothing to lose by trying to find her in that unexplored section of the cave. As usual, her encouragement was contagious and, at least for me, it filled me with hope that I had found a chance to find Emily. At that moment, the image of that amorphous silhouette that we saw passing through the door of the sarcophagus came to me, but I ignored it and focused on the new descent. It had to be 100%. Chisulo and I prepared to go down. Erwin and Dimitri were reluctant, so when another argument was about to break out, Henry said that he would go down with us. Sose also offered to come down. The four of us got ready, and when we had everything ready, we went back downstairs to look for Emily. The four of us were prepared to start the search. We unfolded the drone and the system to be able to see the images. We configured it and lowered it through one of the holes. We looked at the screen as if nothing else mattered to us. We saw how the drone went down that hole through which it would be difficult for a person to pass, waiting for it to reach the end. When he did, a new world opened up before us, where a lake as far as the eye could see covered the entirety of a cave. With the drone, we tried to see if there was anywhere where Emily could be, but we saw nothing but water and galleries that went to unknown places underground. As we watched, Sos yelled for us to stop. He had seen something moving in one of the openings that began its journey into the depths. We turned the drone back and sure enough, we saw something moving. The lack of light from the drone did not allow us to see it clearly, but it seemed to be waving at us. We brought it closer and we saw that it was Emily. She was smiling and waving at the drone. Henry didn't hesitate and got ready to go down a hole he could fit through. He put on a wetsuit so he could get into the water and went down. We tried to dissuade him without success. We used the drone to light the way for him, for which he waved us in thanks. When he reached the entrance to the gallery, he approached Emily. She, in turn, approached Henry. What we saw blew us away. Emily's head popped out, stretching upwards, while the hand she waved with also stretched out like a piece of gum. The other hand was holding a mobile phone, and she started taking flash pictures of Henry, who didn't understand a thing. He began to back away until he was about to fall into the water. That Emily, who was now nothing more than a grotesque caricature, pounced on Henry. From the drone, we saw how he somehow absorbed it into a pulsating gelatinous mass. Henry's screams echoed up to where we were. Chisulo made as if to want to go down to help him, but Soze grabbed him tightly, preventing him from moving. Meanwhile, I picked up the drone with all the speed that the device allowed. I saw how that gelatinous mass approached the drone at great speed, followed it, was climbing the hole next to it. I told Sose and Chisulo, who wanted me to leave the drone and go up immediately. Unfortunately, we didn't have time. That mass had exceeded the speed of the drone and it took a few seconds to come out of the hole like the foam that is formed by mixing baking soda and vinegar. I dropped the device, my companions and I jumped back. Before us, this jelly began to take shape as it accumulated. Like a colossal amoeba, it stood before us with several eyes and nameless appendages, the heads of Henry and Emily protruding from it, as if they had always been a part of himself. Panic invaded us. We didn't know what that thing was or what it did. He clearly showed intelligence, and it made me think of that amorphous figure who opened the door to the sarcophagus room. I was stunned looking at that being, who was slowly approaching me. Sose and Chisulo each grabbed my arm and pulled me hard, forcing me to retreat with them into the cave. Once again we found ourselves running, while Chisulo turned around to constantly tell us that it was following us hard and without pause. My heart was going to jump out of my chest. It was hard for me to breathe. The damn anxiety got the better of me. But the survival instinct overcame me. I ran with my companions without any break, indicating to them, when my voice allowed it, that we should go to the room with the doors to take refuge behind them. I couldn't stop thinking that my friend Henry was dead. I couldn't stand it. I wouldn't see his smile again, nor would he cheer me up like always. We wouldn't share any more adventures. It couldn't be. It was impossible. It was an unreality, and a statistical impossibility what had happened. When I realized we had reached the door, we opened it with a glass and closed it behind us. We dared not go forward or backward. We stood in that narrow corridor in a row, looking at both doors lit by our flashlights, hoping for the worst. Minutes passed. Half an hour. An hour. Nothing. The heat was suffocating. I began to feel claustrophobic. And I definitely lost my mind. I lowered the flashlight, I went to the door through which we had entered and opened it with the glass. Nothing mattered to me anymore. On the other side, an empty room, there was no trace of that being. Chisulo and Sose quietly told me to go back. I ignored it and kept going. He wanted to go back to the surface, and I heard the footsteps of my companions following me at a distance. We walked in silence, only the echo of our footsteps could be heard, when suddenly we heard the radio. Xuchang shouted that a strange being had come out of the cave. We heard shots and blasphemies uttered by Max. That thing had come out of the cave. Xuchang was asking John for help in Blue River until we heard an explosion. There was silence on the radio again. Only interference was heard. I quickened my pace and heard my companions do the same. You had to go up to help them. We got to that damned entrance again, and we found Dimitri's body, crushed by the fall from above. That vision got to me, and I threw up. The horror invaded my whole being, and the deaths and strange things that I had seen until that moment were mixed in my head. Chisulo grabbed me and tried to bring me back to myself. We immediately prepared to climb again, made an effort due to our mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion, and climbed. Halfway, a gelatinous mucus fell on us. We understood that it was that being. We tried to get rid of it as best we could, disgusted, terrified, while we were hanging tens of meters from the ground. We heard a familiar voice. It was Shuchang, telling us that he had died. They had killed him. For a moment, we calmed down and continued with the climb. When we got to the top, Erwin was raving about that thing. He was like collecting samples of it. Shuchang was soaked with that jelly and smiled at us, saying that they had killed her while Max was on his radio asking for reinforcements from the authorities, who seemed to be taking the situation as a joke. The explosion had taken its toll on the camp, and I was surprised that the rest of the members hadn't been damaged. Max gave up trying to get reinforcements and told us we'd better get out of there. Sos refused, stating that given the situation, he could not leave that cave or that thing free, causing harm to more people. Shuchang ignored us and began to repair the radio, while Erwin began to eat the gelatinous mass while he laughed. He had lost his mind. The agent explained to us that the thing had died thanks to Erwin's madness. They were all in the camp when they heard a sort of gurgling coming from the entrance to the cave. When they looked, some kind of jelly was rising from it and forming a strange, amorphous entity in front of them. They were stunned until they saw Henry's head come out of the cave. Shouting, Max started shooting. Shuchang tried to radio John for help. And Erwin started laughing jokingly. The bullets seemed to do nothing to him, and Dmitri appeared out of nowhere with a shovel and lunged at the strange being, who moved away with incredible agility, causing the poor man to lose his balance and fall through the cave entrance without any break. When it seemed that this creature was going to take over the place, between psychotic laughter, Erwin began to yell at the creature to die, and threw dynamite at it, which was absorbed by the creature. Max jumped out of the way and was able to get to safety. It was not necessary to know more. The dynamite exploded, killing the being without giving it time to flee. As the cave was the natural course of a river caused by melting ice, the remains rushed through the cave until they fell on us as we climbed. As we chatted, Erwin began to cough forcefully as he continued to laugh. He started to turn purple as he looked like he was suffocating. Zos performed a Heimlich maneuver on him, but could not get Erwin to cough up what caused him to cough. It was obvious that this jelly was killing him. Shuchang stopped repairing the radio, instructed Sos to stretch the poor devil to the ground, and performed a tracheotomy. When he used a tracheostomy tube to facilitate Erwin's breathing, the horror invaded us again. That jelly he had ingested came out of the tube. Time was pressing and Erwin was still suffocating. Shuchang, despite all efforts, was unable to save him. Erwin suffocated to death in front of us. Once again, silence reigned. We looked at that purple corpse and gave him our condolences. Sos took it upon himself to put that body in an airtight bag so that it could be buried. The cold would keep the deceased in good condition. We all went to what was left of the dining tent and repaired it. When we were done, we sat inside, had drinks, and sat in silence. Only Sose, Chisulo, Shuchang, Max, and me remained. 4 people had died in less than 2 days. 4 deceased with a whole life ahead of them, each a master in his specialty. Unanswered questions plagued me again. What was that being? What was that cave really? How could such ancient constructions continue to function? Who made those structures? What was the point? Why did my companions have to die? Why did Henry have to die? What were we going to do next? The silence was broken by Max saying that he had one thing to do. He put on his hat and walked out to his car. None of us felt strong enough to ask him for an explanation or stop him. We went out to watch as he got into the car and left without saying a word. We look at each other without finding the words with which to start a conversation. We were dirty, tired, sweaty, traumatized. We were certainly in a deplorable state. If Henry was here, he would have known what to say and how to cheer us up. Out of nowhere, an idea appeared in my head. His deaths could not be in vain. We had to find answers. We had to find a way to make sense of everything that happened. By Henry, Emily, Dimitri, and Erwin. They had given their lives horribly. They had lost their lives for no reason. For them, we had to find answers. I transmitted the idea to my colleagues, to which Sos and Shisulo agreed. Each one told me that in their respective cultures they had to honor the dead, and it was the only possibility. Shuchang, much more rational, said that he would fix the radio and keep the dynamite in case any of those things came out of the cave again. Sos offered to stay with him to protect him. Again, and as at the beginning, everything was in the hands of Chisulo and me. How many times had we been up and down that gorge into the depths? He had lost count. The first thing we decided was to take huge amounts of dynamite, up to our load limit, to start by blowing up the holes in the floor of the entrance to prevent more beings like that from coming out. They were agile, intelligent, dangerous, and could change their shape at will. We had to cut them off at least near the exit to the surface. I realized that my mind was beginning to waver. I had a strange dizziness that led me to think about irrational things. Was he losing his mind, or was it just the stress? Maybe it was just my imagination. I didn't give it importance, and as we had done before, we prepared to go down again. When we got to the bottom, the first thing we did was tie sticks of dynamite to ropes, put long fuses on them, and lower them through the holes through which the river water passed each thaw. When they were deep enough, we lit the fuses and covered our ears. The explosions rumbled through the cave and reached the surface. When we uncovered our ears, we could still hear the echoes of the explosions. We looked into the holes with flashlights and saw how they had been blocked by the explosions. We would not get any unpleasant surprises coming through the already non-existent holes. Now we had to explore the cave harder than ever. For our companions. 6. The first objective had been completed. We had cut off one of the possible access routes for those things. We didn't know if there were more, but we didn't want to risk it either. Situlo and I first went to the corridor to the left of the fork, set up a radio repeater, and reported to the surface that we had not encountered any problems so far. We got to the end of the corridor and we found that huge door and the stuck button. Situlo climbed as best he could by making holes in the wall to be able to climb up to it and tried to force it. After a while, he got the button to move inward. A loud click marked the start of the door opening. The door opened with difficulty until it got stuck. We had to force between the two of us to open it until we could get through. On the other side, there was a room illuminated with more crystals and full of strange machines that we could not understand. They were in a perfect state of preservation, and that room did not have a speck of dust. We took photographs and tried to study these artifacts. We were definitely, now without a doubt, in the primeval vestige of an ancient civilization, antediluvian and surely long before Homo sapiens. Those machines were enormous. It was obvious that their creators were much bigger than us and much more advanced. Of all those items, one stood out that looked like a helmet connected to a large machine with several buttons. Situlo approached and touched several of the buttons without knowing what they were doing. With one of the combinations, there was the sound of a kind of turbine that was turned on and the machine came to life, illuminating that strange helmet that could fit 3 human heads. Situlo put it on his head, and after a few seconds he started screaming and having convulsions. I ran over and took off said helmet, put a cloth over his mouth so he wouldn't swallow his tongue, and held his head in my arms until the convulsions stopped. He took a few minutes to come to. He looked at me confused, and I asked him if he was okay. He told me that he had seen strange images that he could not understand, in an incredible rush of thoughts that were not his own. It was as if he understood everything without understanding anything. The truth is that my poor companion expressed himself very badly, and I did not understand what he meant. When he got up, he took a notebook from his backpack, a pencil, and began to draw strange, meaningless things, symbols, abstract drawings. I began to fear that he had lost his mind. After half an hour of drawing, he handed me the notebook and told me to look at it carefully. The pages I had used were full of symbols that I couldn't understand, as if it were a language that didn't follow our logic. Suddenly, something was activated in my head. My vision was overwhelmed by a red haze that did not allow me to see anything. I thought that I had gone crazy or that something had affected my brain. Was it a thing of those strange symbols? Something prevented me from understanding what was happening. As the minutes passed, I came back to myself. I shook my head as if hoping to get rid of that feeling. Chisulo excitedly asked me if he had understood. I told him no. He was disappointed. We tried to find out the operation of the rest of the machines, but we were unable to turn them on. We decided to continue exploring the corridor to the right, so we turned around and went back the way we had come. Something strange was happening. The crystals on the walls and floor had lit up with a strange greenish hue that gave the corridor a mysterious appearance. We ignored it and went back to the fork. There were no danger signs. We broadcast what we had discovered and what had happened to the surface, and Xuchang was concerned about Situlo and the potential effects of the machine he put on his head. When we reported our discoveries, we went down the hall to the left. The same situation was repeated. The crystals that we found along the way were illuminated by the same strange green hue. Finally, we reached the room with the platinum door, saw that there was no sign of anything strange, and went down the stairs that led us to the vaulted room with the hermetic doors. There was no need for lighting, because the ceiling windows were just as illuminated. Even so, we turned on the lights since the greenish light did not allow us to see the doors, because our sight was not adapted to that hue. We tried to open all the doors with the crystals, but they did not react to them, except for the door that led to the sarcophagus room. It was another mystery, which we really did not give importance to. We opened the door to the narrow corridor and proceeded in single file to the sarcophagus room, through the door at the end, and stood in front of the sarcophagus. There was no trace of those gelatinous tendrils. The door at the end of the room was wide open, and we shined our flashlights on it and saw that there was nothing. We breathed a sigh of relief. We decided to continue exploring and advance through that open door. On the other side, another slightly wider corridor where the two of us could fit. We advanced with the flashlights lighting our way, and we saw that this corridor had many marks of that strange language, although they were messy and seemed to have been made in a hurry. The walls and ceiling of the corridor were full of those marks. We decided to take pictures as we went until we reached the end of the corridor, where another door was open. We were so focused that we didn't notice that there was a strange noise in the background, a rhythmic noise that resembled the breathing of a huge animal. Cichulo grabbed a hunting knife and went forward to see what was in this new room. When he advanced a little more than 10 meters in said room, of which we did not appreciate either the ceiling or the walls due to its size, he dropped the knife, which fell to the floor, and its metallic echo resounded in the room. Chisulo stood silently admiring something. I walked up behind him and looked to where I was focusing his gaze. I was just as surprised. A strange machine that towered as far as our lights reached, well beyond their reach, was turned on, and its power source seemed to throb. The gelatinous tendrils that we saw in the sarcophagus covered it. Different pipes that came out of it were lost in the dark. We did not know the scope of this one, but we saw that, somehow, between the many openings and holes that it had in its complicated design, the gelatinous substance seemed to come out of it. Was it the origin of that strange being? What was that intelligent, amorphous jelly? How could the machine still be on after so long? Chisulo didn't think about it, and took out several sticks of dynamite, placed them between the jelly and the machine, and told me to leave. He threw the fuses to the entrance of the room and lit them. A few seconds later, an explosion marked the end of the machine, which stopped beating. That strange source of energy went out without reacting to the explosion, but sloshing noises began to sound. That jelly was reacting to the heat and began to spread on the floor. It spread throughout the room until suddenly it began to fold in on itself and dry up, leaving a strange trail of dry veins and tendrils on the floor. We approached the strange machine, now destroyed, and saw that the explosion had exposed a hole behind it, leading deeper into the darkness. It was just another cavern, with no trace of smooth walls or artificial constructs. We enter it carefully, expecting to find anything. There was the sound of water seeping through the ceiling of the cave. In our path, there were stalactites and stalagmites of various sizes. Finally, we found something normal in that cave. We took photographs and continued advancing through that new cavern that was widening as we advanced. Only our footsteps and the drops of water that fell and that over countless eons had formed those stalagmites and stalactites were heard. We continue advancing aimlessly, again leaving some beacons to show us the way back until we notice a cold draft. We shuddered and tried to find the source of this current, which seemed more like a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation. It looked like a breath taken by some being of enormous size. Suddenly, I tripped over something and fell to the ground. I focused the flashlight and saw a huge fibula. Chisulo helped me up and pointed to something. In front of us, the ground was covered with huge bones. It looked like a disorganized ossuary or an improvised cemetery. Perhaps they were the victims of some unknown predator. We had no choice but to step on these bones to advance, which we had to do carefully and slowly. That current of air was getting stronger and a strange smell invaded our nostrils. It was unpleasant, but it was bearable. At one point, we saw an opening in the ground, surrounded by stalagmites that seemed to mark the limit of that opening. We realized that a dim light came out of that opening, and the air current was much stronger near it. We looked through the opening, and what we saw made our blood run cold. A gelatinous being as far as the eye could see occupied an enormous cavern, pulsating, emitting light and strange appendages forming and disappearing again, absorbed by the main mass. Chisulo let out a terrified scream, and this mass began to form a kind of horrible eyes, similar to those of insects, that stared at us. I calmed my partner down, and a tentacle reached out of the hole, grabbing him. He yelled again. I grabbed his backpack as he held on to one of the stalagmites around the opening. The force of that tentacle was colossal, and our battle was short-lived when the backpack's handles broke. Chisulo's screams continued as he heard the cracking of his bones and the crackling of parts of his body. Tears fell down my cheeks as I didn't know what to do. I decided to take out the dynamite, set the fuses, and tie these cartridges to the stalagmites as quickly as possible. When I finished, I ran out, dragging the fuses with me several meters away. I lit the fuses and ran towards the entrance of the cavern to return to the cave and artificial rooms. Behind me there was an explosion, rocks falling into that hole, and a cry from several non-human voices. When I looked back, I couldn't see anything because of the dust. I took a deep breath and decided to go back the way I had come. I went back through the machine room, down the wide corridor, the sarcophagus chamber, and found myself back in the vaulted room. When I reached the center of the room, the doors of said room began to open. It was those things. I saw clearly by the illumination of the room that they came pouring out from each door and advancing towards me. Instinctively pulling out a stick of dynamite, I hurried through the exit door into the narrow hallway. I opened the door at the end with a piece of glass, lit the stick of dynamite, and threw it into the hallway. I closed the door with the glass and began to run, afraid that those things would follow me. Another explosion, a sloshing, crashing noise that echoed up and down the left corridor of the fork. I heard how those beings parted the rubble to pass. The noise of their advance was horrible and disgusting. They were rushing to catch me. They came after me with a determination and a perseverance that was denoted in the speed of their advance. I ran for my life like I had never done before. I lit a stick of dynamite as I ran and tossed it over me, hoping to hit and slow their progress. One after another every few tens of meters. Explosion after explosion rang and rang as one of those cartridges seemed to hit squarely on those horrifying beings, which exploded with a sloshing and sticky noise. The continuity of the explosions seems to have begun to affect the structural integrity of the cave, which began to shake randomly. Despite its enormous size, this godforsaken place that had survived the passage of countless eons showed for the first time signs of instability. I kept hearing behind me the progress of those beings that were chasing me. The echo of my steps and that of said beings gave rise to echoes that anyone could understand was a persecution. I lit the remaining cartridges I was carrying and threw them back without thinking of the consequences. The shockwave from the explosion knocked me to the ground and shook the cave even more. It left me in a daze, and just before I could focus, part of the ceiling began to crack and fall on me. I covered my head with my arms, hoping the impact of the rubble would be softer. It was a miracle that those rocks that fell on me were benevolent and not very large. Despite this, I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was buried by dust and small rocks. The radio was playing. It was Shu Chang. I was wondering if he was all right. He was scared by the explosions that were heard. I felt bad. I had traces of blood everywhere, and it was hard for me to speak. I told Shu Chang that it was fine. I tried to get up, but I couldn't. My legs were buried under stones and seemed to be damaged. I didn't feel my own legs. Sos went on the radio and said that he would come down to look for me, which he more than fulfilled. The stocky man appeared as a silhouette in the remaining lights. He pulled the rocks off my legs and carried me on his back. I hugged him tightly while crying with fear and panic, crying with emotion at having been saved. As we approached the entrance, a strange noise made my head turn. Behind us were those beings. They were chasing us. I started screaming and instinctively trying to free myself from Sos, who put me down and picked up a knife. He focused behind me but didn't seem to see anything. How could he not see them? They were almost on top of us. I couldn't stop screaming. Sos grabbed me by the shoulders and told me that there was nothing. That it was my imagination. It couldn't be. We had to escape. Sos then made a sad face, looked me in the eyes, and I only saw that darkness. 7. I woke up in a bed. I could see that it was a hospital bed. The room was clearly typical of any medical facility. A voice sounded to my left. I saw it was a nurse. She was turned away and I couldn't see her face. She asked me how I was feeling, and if I was okay. I answered in the affirmative and asked how I got there. The nurse kindly told me that they had brought me from the mountain in bad shape. I looked at my legs and they were healed. I breathed a sigh of relief and thanked the nurse for the treatment I received. When she turned around, I saw that she had no face. I freaked out and tried to get up, but then I realized that she was tied to the bed with zip ties. I screamed in panic. So I woke up again. It was a nightmare. Just a bad dream. I was on one of the beds in the camp tent. Next to me were Henry and Shu Chang. Henry asked me how he was, to which I replied that he was fine. His legs were in splints and full of bandages. Shu Chang very kindly brought me a glass of water. Wait, wasn't Henry dead? What was happening? I was upset. I was confused. Was it all a dream? A nightmare? I did not understand anything. I woke up again, this time in the hotel room in Blue River. He was fine, no bandages, no ties, no pain in his legs. I wondered if it had all been a dream. I felt a bit dirty, so I went to the shower. When I entered, I saw that it was occupied by someone. Due to the steam and the curtains, I couldn't see who was in the shower. I asked who he was and what he was doing there. A guttural voice told me to wait for me. I waited patiently outside the bathroom until I heard the intruder turn off the water and get out of the shower. Started to sing. I told him to get out of the bathroom and he opened the door. I panicked. It was one of those gelatinous beings. I screamed again, falling to the ground in fear, curling into a fetal position. That being with a guttural voice told me to calm down, that it was nothing more than a dream. With the towel tied around his amorphous waist, he left the room and returned a few minutes later with an American coffee. I told him that I liked European coffee. Then he got angry, threw the cup at the window and started yelling that she was ungrateful. I started to cry. Once again I woke up, this time with a jump. She was drenched in sweat and was panting. I looked around. I was back on the bed in the camp tent. I couldn't feel my legs. They were in splints and bandaged. I felt slightly dizzy. Shu Chang entered the store and asked how I was doing. I said dizzy. He told me it was because of the painkillers he had injected me with for the pain. I asked him where Henry was, to which he replied that he was dead. Was I in a dream again, or was it reality? I didn't know what was real and what wasn't. The dizziness and torpor I suffered from had me disoriented. Or maybe it was the situation. Or maybe it was the fragility of my mind. I couldn't think clearly. The Caves of Dementia, Júlia Rosell Saldaña. Sauce entered the store and apologized for leaving me unconscious. He told me that he had no choice in view of my state. I thanked him for getting me out of there. A third person entered the store, introduced himself as John. He was our contact in Blue River. She had come to see how he was. With the three of them there, I asked if what had happened was really what I remembered. Then they asked me what had happened to Chisulo. They were not there and could not know what had happened. It was then that I remembered. The machine, the jelly, the cavern, the amorphous and enormous being underground. Chisulo's bones creaking, the explosions, the persecution by the beings, the sinking of the cave. A sensation invaded me, of restlessness, of fear, of rage, of impotence, of anxiety. I grabbed my head with both hands, pulled my own hair and started screaming again. I saw Dimitri's corpse, the gelatinous Emily that launched itself at Henry, Erwin's death, the tentacle that took Chisulo. I couldn't think. I was back in a loop of horrible thoughts that I couldn't get out of my head. Then I felt someone grab my arm and I saw that Shichang was injecting me with something. She told me that would calm me down, and sure enough, in a few seconds she was falling asleep. My eyelids weighed me down. I felt an artificial well-being that I preferred 1,000 times to what I had felt until a few seconds ago. I smiled as I slowly lowered my arms. I fell asleep again. I don't know how long I was asleep, but when I woke up, Sos was sitting next to me. He caressed my face and asked if he was better. I answered in the affirmative, and then, gently and lovingly, he asked me if he wanted to talk. I felt fine, despite the circumstances, and I told him, as far as my vocal cords still affected by the painkiller allowed, what Chisulo and I had experienced. The machines, Chisulo's strange reaction to one of them. The coloured crystals. The room with the enormous machine full of that jelly. The destruction of the machine. The subsequent cavern. The colossal being underground. The death of Chisulo. The explosions. My escape. The persecution of those beings. The sinking of the cave. I tried to explain as many details as possible, and it took me a long time, since my voice had trouble verbalizing all my thoughts due to the drug that Shichang had injected into me. Sos grabbed my hand and told me that everything had passed. He smiled and told me that he was safe. I smiled back at him and felt the tension he felt slowly disappear. After a while, John entered the store with a cup of coffee that he offered me, while he spoke to me, calmly and slowly. I had the feeling that they thought I was crazy and treated me like a little girl. I thanked him for the coffee and we chatted for a bit. They were keeping me from getting stressed again and going into a spiral of mental self-destruction again. I heard Shichang outside the store say he had a surprise for me. He came in with a pair of crutches and asked me to use them, get up carefully and go outside for some fresh air. Before that, Sos forced me to put on a coat due to how cold it was outside. The four of us were outside while I leaned on my crutches. I asked them again if everything that had happened was real, to which they answered yes. Thanks to the painkillers, I was serene. I didn't give importance to anything, and I just felt I existed, without any concern. I breathed that pure air and looked at the entrance of that cursed cave. Strange thoughts and delusions plagued me again, but I ignored them. The four of us were safe, outside said cave. I asked my colleagues what was known about Max, to which they replied that they did not know. I didn't care at the time, but I couldn't help feeling that my classmates were hiding something from me. When I started to feel tired, Sos took me inside the store and helped me sit on a chair. He told me that in a short time he would have finished everything. I asked him what he meant, and he told me that he shouldn't worry about anything. I worried. What did he mean? He ignored my questions and just went on to talk to me about other things. I decided to humour him. He was in no condition for anything else. Praised for an hour, Max came into the store, took off his hat, and asked me how he was doing. He was apologising for his disappearance, and he told me that everything was prepared. What was prepared, I asked him, to which he replied that the explosives. Explosives. Hadn't there been enough explosions? I couldn't process what they meant. John and Sos lifted me out of the chair, helped me with the crutches, and took me to one of the vans, where they sat me in the passenger seat. From inside, I watched as tents, radio, equipment, cameras were dismantled, and everything was thrown out the cave entrance. I yelled for them to stop, opened the window, and told them to stop. They ignored me. John came over when they were done and said they had decided to pretend nothing had happened. They did not want to leave a trace of what had been discovered. He didn't think the same. The world must know. I got angry. I yelled again for them to stop, that I was going to tell whoever it took. John tried to calm me down, but he couldn't. He coughed me, but I understood that he couldn't do anything to stop them now. John got in the van with me and started it up. He took me above the entrance where you could see the mountain that was a few meters above, and once we were far away, he told me to say goodbye to the cave. After a while, I watched as the other van and Max's car started up. Xuchang parked next to us, got out of the van and stood by the door of our vehicle. Max walked over to the mountain and it seemed like he was stretching some kind of cable. He got back in the car and came over to us with it. When he got out of the car, he had a detonator in his hand and the cable reached the bottom of the mountain. He put the detonator on the ground and walked over to me. She hugged me through the window, and when she pulled away, she took something from his shirt pocket and put it in front of me. It was the picture he had taken of us with Henry's Polaroid when we were all together for the first time. We were all there, smiling, innocent in our ignorance of not knowing what we would find down there. I looked at the face of Henry, that friend who accompanied me for so many years on so many adventures. I didn't have the opportunity to get to know all the members of the team in depth, but it was clear to me that they didn't deserve to die. I put the photograph on my chest and felt tears fall uncontrollably down my face. Max hugged me again and kissed me on the forehead, telling me that he was sorry for what happened. At that moment, he approached the detonator, took a deep breath and activated it. A huge explosion caused an avalanche of rocks on the mountain. A cloud of fire and smoke rose upwards, revealing the position of said explosion, which must have been seen and heard for several kilometers around. That avalanche fell downward until it blocked the entrance to that cave under a wave of rocks. I felt anger and relief at the same time. We had blocked that entrance forever, or so we hoped. Was there another remedy? We had committed a crime. Max must have been the most aware of it because it was his job to safeguard those natural wonders. I didn't want to know where he had gotten those explosives. He didn't want to hear any more of that story. I just looked at the photograph again and continued to cry silently. After a few minutes, everyone came to say goodbye. Sos, Max, and Xuchang stood next to me. They told me that the police would come to see us shortly and that they would arrest us. Max would turn himself in without explanation. There was no other plan than to leave me at the hotel and wait there, patiently, until they came to arrest me. During the return trip, I said goodbye to that wonderful landscape. I said goodbye to my friend and the companions who had accompanied me in that nightmare epic. We arrived at the hotel, and John walked me to my room. Seeing my condition, the hotel workers carried the backpacks. When I was sitting up in bed, John asked me if he wanted him to stay and help me, worried about the state of my legs. I politely replied that it was not necessary. I thanked him for his help, as well as the hotel workers. And I stayed alone in that room. I cleaned up as best I could, put on more decent clothes, and waited. I had nothing else to do but wait for them to come and arrest me. Since nobody came, I went to sleep. At night, I was woken up by a knock on the door asking for me. It was the police. I replied that I would open right away. I grabbed my crutches, got up, and opened the door for them. The police told me that I was under arrest and that they had to take me in for questioning about what happened at Sarlacc's pit. I did not resist. With a smile, I told them that I would be delighted. The two police officers helped me down the stairs while one of them carried the crutches. They carefully put me in the back of their vehicle and drove away. I looked back out the rear window of the police car, trying to retain an image of Blue River. I metaphorically said goodbye to that town while I put my hand on the window pane, hoping somehow that someone would touch it. 8. I was looking at the landscape. The policeman did not speak to me, and the hours passed. I fell asleep. When they woke me up, we were outside a Calgary police station. The officers helped me out of the car and handed me the crutches. We went inside and I was locked in a cell, awaiting the arrival of an inspector with all the information available to be able to interrogate me. She was alone in that cell, perhaps because of the time it was. I was drifting back to sleep when I saw a silhouette in front of me. That figure writhed and called out to me with a guttural voice. When I looked up, I realized it was one of those gelatinous things. I began to scream in panic. I threw myself to the ground and I approached a corner where I tried to get away from that silhouette. A minute later, 2 agents came running to see what was happening to me. They opened the cell door. At first, they thought I was faking it, but when I told them that there was a monster outside the cell, they radioed a doctor who did a quick examination, and seeing that I didn't calm down, he injected me with a painkiller. In a few seconds, I fell unconscious. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room. Next to me was a policeman who gave notice of my recovery of consciousness. A nurse came in, asked how he was doing, and gave me a checkup. I had a drip that went to an IV that was put on the back of my hand. Shortly after, another policeman came in, along with a man dressed in a trench coat and hat in hand, who asked the nurse if it was possible to ask me a few questions. The nurse strongly urged him to be quick and courteous due to my condition. The man introduced himself as Edward, the inspector in charge of my case. He asked me how he found me and if he was aware of what happened. He told me what charges I was being charged with, and that he had the right to a lawyer. He would go to jail for the damage caused to a natural park, as well as for the homicide of the disappeared. I asked him if he had talked to Max, Sosei and Shuchang, to which he replied that it was none of my business. He went on to ask me to tell him what had happened at Sarlacc's pit. He had no graphic evidence of any kind, no trace of the camp or the dead. What did he have to lose if he went to jail? I told him everything that had happened the previous days. Obviously, the inspector didn't believe me. In his place, I wouldn't have believed myself either. He painstakingly wrote down everything I told him, and when he finished, he thanked me and walked out the door. A few hours later, a doctor came in. He told me that he was a psychiatrist and that I should do an evaluation. The next few hours were filled with blank stares from a man who was simply doing his job. When we finished, he told me that for my safety, I would be transferred to the psychiatric wing of the hospital and would be under strict surveillance. I thanked him for his services, and I was waiting for said transfer. Due to the medication, I fell asleep again. They woke me up when my bed was being taken to the psychiatric wing of said hospital. The warders and nurses who attended me were cordial and pleasant at all times. They made me take some pills that kept me calm and somewhat confused. I lost the notion of time. The next few days were spent in a drowsy, confused state where I was wheeled out of the room and had to be fed and helped to the bathroom. It was hard for me to think and focus. My body did not respond. One day a guard came looking for me, saying that he had a visitor. Who could he be? I asked him, and he couldn't answer me. He let me into a waiting room, and a well-dressed man came in with a suitcase. He introduced himself as my lawyer. He had been assigned my case, and he wanted to know what had happened. Since he had nothing to lose, I explained what had happened in as much detail as I had to the inspector. Since she was confused, it took me a long time to tell her everything that had happened the previous days. The lawyer told me that he would study the case and visit me again shortly. The days passed, and I was still the same. A psychologist and a psychiatrist came to see me. My time was summed up in that she was useless, that she couldn't hardly move, and she was drugged all day. She suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations. But she did not give them importance. She only gave them to the ones that made me see and talk to Henry. She made her not feel alone in that place full of lunatics, among whom she included me. She sometimes lost consciousness, although the psychologist told me that she lost her mind and she should not be aware of what she was doing, since she did not remember it when she recovered it. She woke me up, cleaned me up, gave me pills, gave me food, took me to the common room to watch TV, interviewed me, fed me again, and took me to my room to sleep. She was not aware of the passage of time. She was in a state of intoxication from the drugs and did not remember how many days she had been in that centre. Another day, after cleaning and eating, a guard came to take me again since he had a new visitor. He must be the lawyer. He apologised for the delay in coming to see me, but my case had been complicated due to my mental state, and his priority was to get a psychiatric report for trial. I asked him how long it had been since his last visit, to which he replied that it was a month. He told me that according to the expert report, I was a danger to myself and others, that I was suffering from some kind of delusional psychosis that was not fully controlled with medication. There were expectations that he would serve the potential sentence in a psychiatric hospital instead of a prison. He asked me if that was okay with me, and if I wanted anything. I told him that it was in his hands, although I had one wish: to go home. He told me that there were treaties between Spain and Canada, and that he would try by all means to serve his sentence in my country. I guess he felt sorry for me. The days were repeated, and little by little, they changed my medication. I had moments of madness and lucidity alike, but at least the moments of lucidity I could finally manage on my own. I hadn't realised it, and my legs had already recovered. She couldn't remember when or how, but they were no longer in casts or splints. It was difficult for me to walk, but in a few days I was able to walk with ease, under strict surveillance, through the corridors of that psychiatric ward. I had a visit from my lawyer again, who told me the date of the trial and how he was going to proceed. After the police and psychiatric reports, he was going to ask that I be sentenced psychiatrically instead of criminally, citing my insanity as a mitigating factor. I repeated that I was in his hands and that I trusted him. I thanked him for his services and asked him if he knew anything about my companions. He changed his face and asked me if he really wanted to know. I answered in the affirmative. He put his briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out several scraps of newspapers. Between the newspapers and what the lawyer told me, I saw that Max had been sentenced to life in prison for crimes against the environment, abuse of power for the position, and murder of him, among many others. Xu Chang had committed suicide in his cell the night of his detention. Sose was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and John, despite being a suspect unable to prove his collaboration with the crimes, was sentenced to community service after accepting a deal with the prosecution. I couldn't react because of the medication, but I felt a great sadness inside me. The lawyer asked me if he was okay or needed anything, to which I replied that he needed a hug. He looked at a guard, got up, came over to me and hugged me. I burst into tears once more. It had been a long time since he cried or felt that discomfort. The lawyer took my hand, said goodbye, and told me that we would see each other at the trial, that he wished me a full recovery. I said goodbye to him, thanking him again. The days passed again, and I got used to the routine of the psychiatric centre. He kept losing his mind almost every day, according to what the workers at the centre told me, but I didn't remember anything. I just felt like I was losing my mind until I was no longer aware. Over time, I understood little by little that my mind was fragmenting in some way, and I began to recognize the thoughts that led to that madness that made me lose consciousness. The psychiatrist evaluated me as objectively as possible, while the psychologist treated me humanely, which I appreciated. They seemed like the bad cop and the good cop. It was clear to him that they were doing their job, and possibly for them, it was a hopeless case. There were days that I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. Depersonalization, they called it. I daydreamed. I had hallucinations about the gelatinous beings, the deaths of my companions, and that imaginary Henry became my best friend. He accompanied me everywhere, and he was good and cordial with me. He encouraged me and urged me to improve every day. Little by little, I joined the activities of the rest of the inmates of the psychiatric ward, or as we called ourselves, the buzzed group. We drew, we told each other stories, we played cards. There were many activities that I hadn't noticed in all this time. Since I had been in the centre for more than a month, the rest of the inmates already knew me and had seen me evolve over time. Most were kind in their particular situation and cared about me. There were times when I laughed, smiled, got angry, all to a lesser degree than I was used to, probably because of the medication, but I enjoyed the good times, which I treasured in my heart, like a gift. Finally, the day of judgment arrived. They gave me clothes to wear and some policemen took me to court. Due to my condition, I couldn't find out much, except that time seemed eternal in that room before the judge. I know that many people spoke. Witnesses, psychiatrist, psychologist, police inspector, the police officers who arrested me. The little I was able to retain is the excellent work my lawyer did, which could be summed up as treating me as crazy with little expectation of healing, along with post-traumatic stress due to what happened. When the trial was over, the lawyer made me get up, shook my hand, and told me that when there was a sentence, he would come by and see me. The policeman took me back to the psychiatric centre where I was staying. After all, it was my home now. That night, I remembered the photograph I had the day they arrested me. I asked the guards and nurses if they knew anything about said pictograph, to which they replied that the police brought it along with other belongings. A nurse said that he would talk to the psychiatrist and the psychologist to ask if they could give it to me. I thanked. After about half an hour, the nurse appeared with the photograph, which he handed to me. I held her with both hands on my chest and smiled. That nurse gave me a hug, and he told me that he was glad he had given me a joy. I looked at that photograph for hours until I left it on the table in my room. I thought of all the companions and that, despite not knowing them very well, the adventure that we lived those days. I thought of Dimitri and his rocks, Erwin and his microscope, Emily and his drones, Chisulo and his encouragement, Henry and his positivity, Sose and his friendliness, Shuchang and his radio. I looked into the darkness, and for a moment my mind did a gift. Everyone was there, smiling as they looked at me, each in their own way, expressing themselves without saying a word. I felt accompanied by them, and I missed them once again. I thanked everyone, apologized for what happened, and said goodbye, even though it was a hallucination. They all waved goodbye to me wordlessly, while giving one last group hug before me as they began to fade away. I couldn't help but shout goodbye to them while crying. A nurse came to see if I was okay and to ask me not to scream. I apologized and told him that I was saying goodbye to my fellow expedition members. The poor woman, surely exhausted from working late at night, sighed, and she asked me again to please try to sleep. That night, I remember that it was the first in a long time that I slept feeling at peace, feeling that I had been able to say goodbye to all of them, even knowing that I would never see them again. Epilogue. One day, the lawyer came to see me again, that lawyer who had done an immense job with my case and to whom I was grateful. Indeed, the sentence was to sentence me to stay in the psychiatric hospital for several years. I did not want to know how many, nor was it of interest to me. She was clearly not sane and understood the ins and outs of the situation. The lawyer told me that he had been in contact with the Spanish consulate in Alberta, where the procedures were carried out together with the Spanish embassy in Ottawa. He explained to me that some policemen would come to pick me up and take me to the Calgary airport, where they would hand me over to agents of the Spanish National Police, who would take me to Spain, where I would be admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Barcelona. He told me that it was the last time we would see each other and that it had been a pleasure. We said goodbye, knowing that we would never see each other again. The weeks passed, and I was immersed in that crazy routine, if I may use the expression. The visits with the psychologist and the psychiatrist were a bit farther apart in time because it seems that beyond what the medication did, little more could be done for my mental health and my psychosis. Finally, one day the police came for me. They asked me if I wanted to take any belongings with me, to which I replied that I only wanted my documentation and that photograph taken with a Polaroid. They could keep the rest of my belongings after all. I was going home. The police officers escorted me to the airport, where they handed me over to 2 national police officers who showed up and took me to the plane that would take me back to Spain. Upon entering the plane, I asked the policeman if I could sit by the window so I could see the trip and the landscape, to which they answered in the affirmative. They were extremely attentive, and during the trip, except when I fell asleep due to fatigue and the effect of the medication, they made sure that I was comfortable and cared for. As I did on the way out, I spent a good deal of time looking out the window to soak up the sights and save them for memories. We arrived in Madrid, and the policeman, who had me in handcuffs, made me go to another flight to take me to Barcelona, although beforehand they handed me over to 2 different policemen. Unlike the long flight from Calgary, the flight to Barcelona was quick. When we were in Barcelona, I was escorted to a police car where 2 other policemen were waiting for me to take me to the Hospital del Mar, which would be my home for many years. During the trip, I was stunned again looking out the car window while trying to have a conversation with the policemen, who, despite being serious, were cordial and pleasant with me. We did not take long to arrive, and they made me enter the hospital. When we entered the Parc de Salut Mar admissions area, they took off my handcuffs and left me in the hands of the centre's workers. They were given a huge amount of papers, said goodbye to me, and left. After a short time, a nurse came for me and took me to a psychiatrist, who evaluated me again while looking at my police file. There were moments when I lost my mind, and I ended up losing consciousness as usual. When I woke up, I was in a fairly simple room, lying on the bed in said room. I got up and looked out the window. The views of the Mediterranean Sea that had seen me born and grow up seemed fascinating to me. When I realised it, on the table in the room I had the photograph in which all the companions of the expedition were smiling. I didn't need any more personal items. When I stopped to think about it, I realised that I wouldn't be better off anywhere else. I made life in that centre as time passed. I had some friends to whom I wrote letters, and they wrote back to me. I passed the time typing on a typewriter provided for me and recalled my life experiences during moments of clarity. I had no family, no pets, no job. I had no other responsibilities than being just another crazy person in a crazy world, while I was in a shelter where I couldn't hurt myself or others. Somehow, the story of my life had ended one of its most distressing chapters. Only the epilogue of that story remained in the form of madness and psychosis.